The sun had barely risen when Alice Pereira opened her eyes, staring at the cracked ceiling of her small apartment. The alarm hadn't gone off yet, but sleep had already abandoned her. Something about that morning felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried a quiet warning she couldn't quite understand. She lay still for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the city waking up. Cars passing, a neighbor's radio murmuring through thin walls, the hum of life continuing without noticing her anxious thoughts. Today was supposed to be important. She knew that much, yet she had no idea just how deeply it would mark her life. Alice slowly pushed herself out of bed and walked toward the narrow window. The city looked the same as always, gray and indifferent, but her chest tightened with anticipation. This was the day she would start her internship at Montenegro Enterprises, a company whose name alone carried weight and prestige, a place she had dreamed of reaching,
even when it felt impossibly far from her reality. She moved through her morning routine with care, choosing her clothes thoughtfully, simple, modest, professional. As she brushed her hair, her reflection stared back at her with a mixture of determination and insecurity. She reminded herself that she belonged there, even if every doubt in her mind whispered otherwise. Money had always been tight. Dreams had often felt like luxuries. Still, she had worked tirelessly for this opportunity, sacrificing weekends, nights, and pieces of herself along the way. This internship was more than a job. It was her chance to change her story. As Alice stepped out of her apartment and locked the door behind her, she took a deep breath, unaware that in just a few hours, her carefully planned life would begin to unravel in ways she never imagined. She walked toward the bus stop, carrying nothing but her bag, her hopes, and a future she didn't yet know was about to collide with someone else's.
The bus ride felt longer than usual. Alice stood near the door, gripping the metal pole as the city blurred past the window. With every stop, her thoughts drifted further inward, replaying reminders she had repeated to herself for years. Stay focused, don't draw attention, work harder than everyone else. When she finally stepped off and stood before the towering glass building of Montenegro Enterprises, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. The entrance was wide and polished, people in tailored suits moving with purpose, as if they belonged to a world that had already decided its winners. Alice adjusted her bag and walked inside, her footsteps quiet against the marble floor. At the reception desk, her name sounded smaller than she expected when she said it out loud. An intern. The word followed her as she was directed toward the elevators, surrounded by voices that spoke confidently about meetings, deals, and numbers she didn't yet understand. No one looked at her for more than a second. She blended into the background effortlessly. That had always been her role. As she settled into her assigned desk, Alice observed everything. The rhythm of keyboards, the hushed conversations, the sharp glances exchanged between coworkers. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the rules that were never written down. Don't interrupt. Don't question too much. Don't make mistakes. Someone nearby mentioned the CEO in a lowered voice, as if saying his name too loudly might summon him. Luiz Felipe Montenegro. The way people spoke about him was a mix of respect and fear. Demanding, brilliant, untouchable. Alice caught herself wondering what kind of man inspired such tension without even being present. Throughout the morning, she completed small tasks with precision, determined to prove she was capable. Yet the more she tried to make herself useful, the more invisible she felt. Others moved around her with practiced ease, while she remained careful, cautious, always aware of her place. During a brief pause, Alice glanced at the office windows overlooking the city. From up here, everything seemed distant and unreal. She pressed her fingers together, steadying herself, reminding herself why she was there. This was only the beginning. She couldn't afford fear. Still, as she returned to her screen, she couldn't shake the strange sensation that she was being pulled into something far bigger than she understood, a world where remaining invisible might soon become impossible. High above the city, Behind walls of glass and steel, Luiz Felipe Montenegro reviewed reports with mechanical precision. Every number on the screen made sense. Every projection followed logic. Control, after all, had always been his greatest strength. At 42, he was exactly where the world expected him to be, CEO of a multinational empire built on discipline and relentless ambition.
His name commanded respect in boardrooms and silence in hallways. People listened when he spoke and feared disappointing him. Yet as he leaned back in his chair, loosening the knot of his tie, Luiz felt the familiar emptiness settle in his chest. Success had never been the problem. It was everything that came after. His office was immaculate, untouched by personal objects. No photos, no memories. Just polished surface stretched endlessly beyond the windows. He preferred it that way. Attachments complicated things. Feelings distracted. And distractions cost power. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. An assistant entered briefly, updating him on schedules and deadlines. Luiz nodded without looking up. Efficiency mattered more than pleasantries. Once alone again, he glanced at the time and stood, straightening his jacket. Another day of meetings awaited him. As he stepped into the private elevator, his reflection stared back at him, calm, composed, distant.
Few knew the truth behind that image. Years ago, he had learned the cost of trusting the wrong person, of allowing emotions to interfere with judgment. Since then, he had built walls no one had managed to cross. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where silence reigned. Employees moved aside instinctively as he passed, eyes lowered, conversations cut short. Luiz noticed none of it. He was used to being the center of gravity without effort. Yet as he entered the main corridor, a subtle unease brushed against him. Not a threat, not a problem, just a strange awareness, as if something unseen had shifted within the building itself. He dismissed the feeling and continued forward, unaware that several floors below, a young intern was quietly finding her place in his world, one small step at a time. And without knowing it, both of them were moving toward a moment neither control nor distance would be able to prevent.
Alice was walking down the corridor with a folder pressed tightly against her chest when she felt it, a sudden shift in the air, a silence that spread unnaturally fast. Conversations faded. Footsteps slowed. Instinctively, she lifted her gaze. He was approaching from the opposite end of the hallway. Even before she recognized his face, she understood who he was. Luiz Felipe Montenegro moved with quiet authority, his presence commanding attention without effort. His expression was unreadable, eyes focused ahead, as if the world arranged itself automatically around his path. Alice hesitated, unsure whether to step aside or continue walking. The decision was made for her when he stopped directly in front of her. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The noise, the office, the urgency of the day. His gaze was sharp, assessing, but not unkind, just curious enough to make her heart race. Alice felt heat rise to her cheeks, her grip tightening on the folder.
"I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice softer than she intended. Luiz glanced at the papers in her hands, then back at her face. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, he nodded slightly and stepped aside, allowing her to pass. As she moved away, her pulse pounded in her ears. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to look at her at all. Luiz remained where he was, watching her retreating figure for a fraction longer than necessary. Something about her presence lingered, unsettling him. It wasn't recognition, it was disruption. He turned and continued on his way, irritation flickering beneath his calm exterior. There was no reason for that encounter to matter, no reason for the sudden tension in his chest. And yet, as Alice reached the end of the corridor, she glanced back, only to find him already gone. Both of them resumed their routines moments later, pretending nothing had happened. But the space between them,
once empty and unnoticed, now carried a quiet charge neither of them could explain. Alice learned quickly that Montenegro enterprises functioned on rules no one ever explained aloud. They existed in glances, in lowered voices, in the way employees straightened their posture whenever a certain presence was near.
She observed them carefully, determined not to misstep. By mid-afternoon, she had already sensed one of the most important truths. Distance mattered, especially from the top. She was reviewing documents at her desk when a shadow fell across the papers. Alice looked up, her breath catching almost instantly. Luiz Felipe Montenegro stood there, expression neutral, hands in his pockets. "You're with the finance team?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing immediately. He nodded once. "Be precise with these reports. Accuracy is not optional." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Alice swallowed and nodded, meeting his gaze only briefly before lowering her eyes. "I will." For a moment, he seemed as though he might say more. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. Around her, co-workers exchanged subtle looks. No one commented, but the message was clear. She had crossed into his awareness, and that was dangerous territory. The rest of the day passed with uneasy focus. Alice worked harder than ever, triple-checking every detail, aware that even the smallest mistake could define her. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity growing inside her. There was something restrained about him, something carefully controlled. From his office, Luiz reviewed the reports she had submitted. They were flawless. That irritated him more than he cared to admit. Competence demanded acknowledgement, yet acknowledging her felt like breaking an unspoken boundary. He closed the file and leaned back, staring at the ceiling.
This was exactly why lines existed, why involvement of any kind was discouraged. She was an intern, he was the CEO. The imbalance was obvious, the consequences inevitable. As the workday ended, both of them carried the same unspoken thought with them. Whatever had begun in that corridor should go no further. Over the next few days, silence became a language of its own. Alice noticed it in the way conversations paused when Luiz entered a room, in the careful distance people maintained from his path. She also noticed it in smaller moments, when she felt his presence before seeing him, when her focus slipped without warning, when her name echoed in her thoughts at the most inconvenient times. They crossed paths more often than either of them expected. In meeting rooms, she would pass him documents without their fingers touching, yet the space between them felt charged. In hallways, their eyes met briefly before turning away,
as if both were silently agreeing not to acknowledge what lingered beneath the surface. Alice tried to convince herself that it was nothing. Admiration, perhaps, intimidation, a passing distraction. Still, her heart betrayed her every time he appeared, beating just a little faster than it should. From his office, Luiz observed her with equal restraint. He noticed the discipline in her work, the quiet confidence growing beneath her initial hesitation. He told himself his attention was professional, nothing more. And yet, he found excuses to review her reports personally, to ensure her tasks aligned with his standards. Each encounter ended the same way. A glance held for half a second too long, a breath taken at the wrong moment, then interruption, a colleague, a ringing phone, a meeting that demanded immediate attention. The interruptions became routine, almost expected. Late one afternoon, Alice stepped into the elevator just as the doors began to close. They reopened, revealing Luiz standing inside. Neither spoke as the doors shut again, sealing them into a narrow space filled with unspoken tension. The ride lasted less than a minute, but it felt endless. When the doors opened, Luiz stepped out first, pausing just long enough to speak. "Good work today," he said quietly, without turning back. Alice stood frozen as he walked away, her chest tight, her thoughts scattered. It was a small sentence, insignificant really. And yet, in that moment, both of them understood the truth they refused to name. Silence was no longer enough to keep distance intact. The storm arrived without warning. By the time the first thunder cracked across the sky, most of the building had already emptied. Alice remained at her desk,
Focused on finishing a report she was determined not to leave incomplete. Rain lashed violently against the windows, the city below dissolving into blurred lights and shadows. She checked the time and sighed. The buses would be delayed.
Leaving now would mean standing in the rain for who knew how long. Reluctantly, she gathered her things, only to be stopped by a familiar voice behind her. "You should wait it out," Luiz said. "The roads are already flooding." She turned slowly, surprised to find him standing there, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. Without the usual layers of formality, he looked different, more human, less distant. "I was just leaving," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. He glanced toward the windows, where lightning illuminated the darkened office. "It's not safe." There was no command in his tone this time, just concern. They moved to the small lounge area near the executive offices, the silence between them filled only by the rain pounding against the glass. For the first time, there were no colleagues nearby, no interruptions, just the steady rhythm of the storm and the low hum of the building's emergency lights. Minutes passed. Then words followed, tentative at first.
Alice spoke about her studies, her family, the pressure she felt to succeed. Luiz listened quietly, his attention fully on her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I didn't always plan to live this way," he admitted. "Control becomes easier than vulnerability." The confession surprised them both. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. The space between them seemed to shrink with every heartbeat. Alice became acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from him, of how difficult it suddenly was to breathe normally. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. When the lights flickered briefly, Alice's breath caught. Luiz reached out instinctively, his hand brushing hers. The contact was accidental, brief, but it sent a shock through them both. He withdrew immediately, tension returning to his expression. "We shouldn't," he said quietly. Alice nodded, even as her heart rebelled. Outside, the storm showed no signs of ending.
And inside the building, something fragile and dangerous had already begun to take shape. The storm softened, but the tension between them did not. Alice stood by the window, arms folded tightly against herself, watching rain trace slow paths down the glass. She felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted, and she no longer trusted her balance. Behind her, Luiz remained still, his presence heavy, unavoidable. "This was a mistake," he said at last, his voice controlled but strained. She turned to face him. "Nothing happened," she replied, though even she didn't fully believe it. Their eyes locked again, and this time neither looked away. The silence stretched, no longer cautious, but charged with something dangerous and raw. Luiz took a step closer, then stopped, as if giving himself one last chance to retreat. "I should ask you to leave," he said quietly. Alice's heart pounded. "Then do it." He didn't. Instead, his hand rose, hesitating just inches from her face. Alice's breath caught, her entire body aware of that small space between them. When his fingers finally brushed her cheek, the restraint they had both been clinging to shattered. The kiss was sudden, unplanned, and unmistakably real. It wasn't rushed or aggressive, just heavy with emotion, with everything they hadn't said and everything they knew they shouldn't feel. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to the warmth between them and the sound of their breathing. Then reality returned. Luiz pulled back first, his expression dark with conflict. "This can't happen," he said, more to himself than to her. Alice nodded, her lips still tingling, her thoughts spinning. She felt both exhilarated and ashamed, caught between desire and fear. Without another word, Luiz stepped away, putting distance between them once more. The storm outside had nearly passed, but inside, the damage was already done. They had crossed a line neither of them could pretend didn't exist.
And as Alice gathered her things to leave, she knew with unsettling certainty that nothing between them would ever feel simple again. Sleep refused to come that night. Alice lay awake in the darkness of her apartment, replaying every second of the evening over and over again.
The way his hand had hesitated, the weight of the kiss, the silence that followed. Each memory tightened the knot in her chest, leaving her torn between regret and longing. By morning, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. At the office, she moved carefully, avoiding places where she might run into him. Her focus fractured easily, her thoughts drifting despite her best efforts. Every sound made her turn. Every shadow sparked unnecessary hope or fear. She reminded herself again and again that what happened was a mistake, one that could cost her everything. From behind closed doors, Luiz struggled with his own unrest. He arrived earlier than usual, burying himself in work, determined to reassert control.
The kiss replayed in his mind against his will, not as a moment of weakness, but as something disturbingly honest. That frightened him more than he cared to admit. When he finally saw her across the office floor, their eyes met for the briefest instant. Alice looked away immediately. The distance hurt more than he expected. Throughout the day, their communication remained strictly professional. Emails were concise. Instructions were precise. Not once did either of them acknowledge what lingered beneath the surface. Yet every interaction carried an undercurrent of restraint, as if both were holding their breath. By late afternoon, the tension had become unbearable. Luiz stood at the window of his office, watching the city below, aware that his carefully constructed boundaries had been compromised. He knew what the logical response was: distance, detachment, correction. But logic offered no relief. As Alice packed her bag to leave,
She felt the weight of his unspoken presence, even without seeing him. Desire and fear pulled her in opposite directions, each equally powerful. They had crossed a line, and now neither of them knew how to return to the safety of before. The days that followed were defined by distance. Luiz became precise to the point of coldness, limiting his presence on the floors where Alice worked. Meetings were reassigned, schedules adjusted. The space between them grew wider, deliberate and controlled. From the outside, it looked like professionalism restored. From the inside, it felt like punishment. Alice noticed immediately. The absence was louder than his presence had ever been. She told herself it was for the best, that clarity required separation. Yet each time she passed his office and saw the door closed, a quiet ache settled in her chest. She worked harder than ever, staying late, volunteering for additional tasks, determined not to give anyone reason to question her place there.
Still, the silence followed her, the kind that pressed in from all sides. One evening, as she struggled with a complex report, an email notification appeared on her screen. From Luiz Felipe Montenegro. The message was brief. Review the final projections before submission. Accuracy matters. Nothing more. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She replied promptly, professionally. Still, her heart raced in a way it never had before. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the restraint behind them. From his office, Luiz watched the time pass without moving. He told himself the message had been necessary, nothing personal. Yet the relief he felt when her response appeared on his screen betrayed him. Later that night, as Alice prepared to leave, she noticed the office was nearly empty. Passing by the executive corridor, she slowed unconsciously. The door to his office was slightly open. Inside, Luiz stood alone, staring out at the city, his posture tense. He didn't turn when she passed, but she knew, somehow, that he was aware of her. They said nothing. They didn't look at each other. And yet the distance between them hurt more than any closeness ever could. The tension reached a breaking point on a quiet afternoon. Alice was organizing files in the conference room when she sensed him before she saw him. Luiz stood by the door, his presence filling the space instantly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different now, heavier, more urgent. "You're avoiding me," he said calmly. Alice straightened, her pulse quickening. "I thought that's what you wanted." He exhaled slowly, closing the door behind him. "I thought distance would make this easier."
She met his gaze, surprised by the honesty she found there. Gone was the cold authority she had grown accustomed to. In its place was something uncertain, almost vulnerable. "It didn't," he continued. "It only made things clearer." Alice swallowed. Clearer how?
Louise hesitated, as if weighing every possible consequence. "I don't want this to be another mistake," he said quietly. "I don't want something hidden, rushed, or careless." The words settled between them, fragile and dangerous all at once. Alice felt her chest tighten, hope stirred, quickly followed by fear. "This could ruin everything," she whispered. "I know." His voice softened. "That's why I want to do it right, or not at all." For a long moment, neither moved. The weight of what he was offering pressed against her doubts. She had imagined many outcomes, but not this one. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he replied, without hesitation. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. The promise hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable, a future neither of them was ready to define, but neither could ignore. As Alice left the room, her thoughts raced. Hope and uncertainty walked side by side, inseparable now. And somewhere deep inside,
She sensed that whatever came next would demand more courage than either of them had ever given before. The change was subtle at first. Alice noticed it in the way conversations quieted when she entered a room, in glances that lingered a second too long before turning away. A whisper stopped abruptly near the coffee station. A smile that didn't reach someone's eyes. Nothing concrete, just enough to unsettle her. Rumors, she realized, never needed proof to grow. From his office, Louise sensed it too. A shift in the atmosphere. Questions disguised as casual remarks. A board member requesting an unexpected meeting. He had built his career anticipating threats before they became visible, and this felt familiar. Danger approaching quietly, patiently. One afternoon, Alice was called into Human Resources for a routine review. The meeting was polite, professional, and carefully neutral. Still, as she walked out, her hands trembled slightly. Someone had noticed. Someone was watching.
Later that day, Louise received an email marked urgent, a potential restructuring, new oversight, external consultants who would observe internal dynamics. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. When their paths crossed again in the corridor, neither spoke, but understanding passed between them instantly. What had once been personal now carried consequences far beyond emotion. That evening, as the office emptied, Alice paused at the exit, uncertainty weighing on her. Louise stood several feet away, his expression unreadable, his jaw set with determination. "This isn't over," he said quietly. She nodded, fear and resolve mixing in her chest. "I know." They parted without promises, without certainty, only awareness. Outside, the city lights flickered on, indifferent as ever. Somewhere within those lights, decisions were being made. Decisions that could cost them everything they had worked for, or force them to choose what truly mattered. And as Alice stepped into the night,
She understood one thing with absolute clarity. The greatest challenge of her life was no longer falling in love. It was surviving what came next.